Alright guys, we're back in my garage for another video, and today we're going to be talking about xHP transmission tuning again. If you guys haven't seen it, definitely go check out part 1 of these videos that I've made where I talk more about the off-the-shelf maps, and I kind of explain how xHP groups a bunch of these custom settings and features into packages that they call Stage 1, Stage 2, and Stage 3. Now in this video, we're going to talk more specifically about the individual settings that you can change for each of these off-the-shelf maps. And this just allows you to further tailor any of the tunes for your specific driving style, engine setup, turbo setup, drivetrain, all the different things that can impact how you enjoy your car. So I'm going to go through all the different options and features and how they work. And hopefully you guys find this useful if you're trying to dial in the transmission tune on your specific vehicle. Now, as always, for everybody that's new to the channel, I create these videos to help keep you updated on the latest developments in our community, as well as discuss technical topics so that we have a better understanding of how our engines work. So if you're interested in more videos like that, be sure to subscribe because there will be a lot more coming out in the future. So let's go ahead and talk about the custom settings in xHP. And this is one of those things that I still plan on playing with more as I get more familiar with the car, but I just have learned a lot by going through all the settings and wanted to go ahead and share it with you guys. Now, keep in mind, this video is not going to tell you the perfect settings. I can't even tell you that in all honesty because it's really going to be specific to you and your driving style and what you're looking to get out of your car. So hopefully this video just kind of explains how the settings work, and it's really up to you guys to determine where there's a gap, what you want to improve, and then you can use these ideas as settings that you can modify and just try to see if you can improve things. So get really comfortable with flashing your cars, adjusting sliders, checking boxes on and off, and that'll give you the best opportunity to dial in the car perfectly so that it performs the way that you want it to. Now, the one that you've probably heard the most about is drag race mode, and this was one of the features that was released last year, and a lot of people have actually used it with pretty good results, but it also is somewhat of a risky setting. Now, the whole purpose of this is basically to put your transmission into the fastest, highest performing mode possible, but some of the ways that it does that can potentially put your transmission at risk. It disables the torque reduction between shifts, which we'll talk more about in a little bit, but basically that gives you the fastest shifts possible, but it also can potentially put extra torque to your transmission that can potentially cause slippage. It also maximizes your shift pressures, so every time you shift, it's going to clamp as hard as possible so that you can hold as much torque as possible. It's also going to raise the clutch protection threshold, so if there's any potential for interference due to how much torque is being sent from the engine to the transmission, it's going to disable all of those limits so that the transmission can just pull as hard as possible and accept whatever torque the engine is putting out. And overall, that's basically just going to help guarantee that you get your best 60 foots, your best eighth mile times, and your best quarter mile time. So that's why they call it drag race mode. It's really about getting your car from point A to point B as quickly as possible in a straight line. Now keep in mind the setting isn't just always active, so when you're cruising around town, you're not going to have all of these things kind of interfering and putting extra stress on your transmission. It's only going to work when you use launch control. So after you launch, then it'll automatically be in drag race mode for the duration of your pull. Or if you're in Sport Plus or DSC off and above 40% throttle, then it'll also automatically engage this drag race mode. So the whole goal is that you only use it when you need it, when you're really trying to accelerate quickly. Otherwise, it'll revert to the regular off-the-shelf map settings. Now, the next setting that we're going to talk about is torque reduction on upshifts. And this was one of the settings that they actually include in drag race mode, where basically they reduce the torque reduction between shifts. And what that means is basically when the transmission is shifting, it's very similar to a manual where you have to release the gas, shift gears, and then reapply the gas and send that torque back through the transmission. Now, you're still able to do that quick enough in an automatic that you don't typically lose boost, but if you have like a bigger turbo, for example, then the stock shift times and the torque reduction that it automatically uses is potentially going to add a little bit of lag and almost make it feel lazy when it shifts. So you can reduce how much the torque is reducing, which is kind of a double negative, so I'll explain the sliders in a minute. But by doing that, it'll help give you like crisper shifts, and with a bigger turbo, it'll help reduce the lag or the laziness that you might feel during shifts. So like I said, this might operate in reverse of what you assume because it's kind of a double negative, but you have these sliders. If you slide it positive, then it is going to increase the torque reduction, which basically means that gap and how much power it's pulling between shifts is going to be larger. So that can potentially give you slower performance. Even though it's moving to the plus, it's actually increasing the torque reduction. Now on the other side, if you move it to the negative, then it decreases that torque reduction. So whatever that dip in power is between shifts, it's going to reduce that and basically give you more consistent torque through the shifts. So kind of play with those settings, especially if you have a bigger turbo and you feel like your transmission is starting to feel lazy. You can reduce that torque reduction and it'll hopefully help keep the turbo spooled by really driving things straight through as you shift. On the other hand, if you want to increase that torque reduction, it can actually give you louder shifts and kind of help give you some of that brap sound that some people are looking for, where, you know, basically the car is pulling power for a little bit and you're going to hear that really loud noise that is kind of characteristic of shifting, you know, faster transmissions. Now, the next setting that you can adjust is customizing your launch control. Again, this is something that I know a lot of the fast guys really don't use, but it's still something that's fun to play with. And launch control is something that's built into the car. So if it's already going to be there from the factory, you might as well optimize it. Now, the two things you can customize in your launch control is your launch torque and your torque scaling. And each of these are modified individually. Your launch torque is basically how much torque is sent to the wheels when you come off of the brakes. So you can increase this to basically put down as much torque as possible, or you can decrease it a little bit, usually to kind of help with traction, but it can also be used to protect components. You know, if you're on a really grippy surface and you want to protect your drivetrain, drive shaft, axles, whatever, then you can pull that back a little bit. Now, the torque scaling is basically your traction control. So this allows you to basically increase the amount of traction control intervention or reduce it so that it relaxes a little bit and lets the tires slip. Usually you want it to slip a little bit and then let it grip and go. So you don't want it to fight you while you're trying to launch, but you also don't want it just to spin and do like a crazy burnout. So you can play with that slider to try to find the optimal setting that gives you the best launch. Now in this one, if you go to the positive, it's actually going to increase how much slip it allows. So if you want the car to spin a little bit and you feel like the traction control is interfering too much, you don't go negative to reduce the traction control. You actually increase it. So go to the positive and that will allow more wheel slip. And then on the other hand, if you think it's spinning too much, then you can push it back negative to reduce the wheel slip and try to help your traction control jump in earlier so that, you know, you can get the car moving forward. Now, the last setting at the bottom is an override for brake boost. And this is another critical component because typically people like to build up as much torque as possible, but you also don't want to break anything. This brake boost feature is basically designed to protect your components, especially when you're launching, because in lower gears like first or second gear, there's a really big multiplier going through the torque converter before it actually gets to the rest of your drivetrain. And that limits how much torque and power is getting put out when you launch so that you don't break anything. But if you want to relax that, you can go plus 5, 10, or 15%, and that will allow you to basically raise those limits and override it, or you can disable it completely so that you can put down all the available torque right at the launch. Just again, keep in mind that this can potentially damage components, so you're kind of using this at your own risk. One thing they do recommend, and you'll see this as a common theme, is if you're planning on using this, you should set a maximum amount of torque in your tune. You can do that by gear, so in first and second gear, you can set a lower amount of torque based on the amount of available traction you have. If you have beefed up components, you can increase it. If you still have stock components, you can dial it back. And that helps make sure that even if you disable this in your transmission tune, you have a safe engine tune that's set up for the best performance and safety of your vehicle. So somewhere in there, you should try to manage the torque control so that you're not breaking anything. Now, the next setting is your shift map editor, and this is one that I think I'm going to be playing with for a while. The whole purpose here is to optimize where your car is shifting and where it's trying to drive when you're using a specific mode. You can set this for drive and sport in the transmission modes, and each one individually can be adjusted to your liking, so you can make drive a little bit more conservative and sport a little bit more aggressive, and do whatever you want with it to optimize it for your specific use. Now, this is where I think they do a good job with drive mode already, but you have 4 presets, relaxed and relaxed plus, and sportive plus. and these can further adjust it up or down, to different regions that they have already set for you. And then above that, you can completely customize it. If you hit the little wrench icon, then you can go through the editor and move and adjust each individual gear's shift points so that you can keep it in an optimal rev range. This is really nice if you guys are upgrading your turbos. I've talked about this in the past, but if you have a bigger turbo, it's a good idea to raise your shift points and drive, above 2000 RPM most of the time. That just gives you better response from the turbo, and it's just easier and more comfortable to drive. Normally in the stock form, the car is trying to stay like around 1500 RPM, and it's just really not great even for the stock turbo. So for the stock turbo on my car, I try to keep it around 2000 to 2500 RPM when I'm driving around town. It feels comfortable. It kind of matches how I drive my manual transmission car, and everything is just really peppy and ready to go as soon as I apply a little extra gas. So you can play with these settings however you want. It does have a couple protection features in there because, like, for first gear, for example, you can set it to shift at a really high point, and then second gear can shift at a really low point, and they'll actually overlap or interfere with each other. So it'll try to prevent you from, creating any scenarios like that aren't realistic and won't shift properly. But, just adjust the sliders. If you adjust first gear, typically you want to adjust second through eighth all the way down and get everything kind of scaled out a little bit to match, and then just try it out and see how everything works. It's something, again, you can't flash your transmission too many times, so play with these sliders until it really lines up with what your goals are. Now, the next feature is max RPM, and this is something that I plan on taking more advantage of when I'm doing, draggy testing and everything on my car. The whole goal here is basically to limit how high the engine revs. And I think this is really nice because our transmissions don't have a completely linear gear set. So you guys might notice every time you shift gears, it's a little bit different. Some of them have a long pull, some of them have a short pull, and it really just depends on how close the gears are to each other as you upshift. So what I plan on doing is basically using my logs to determine what that spread is if I do wide open throttle shifts, and then setting that so it shifts around 6500 RPM, 6000 to 6500. But the real goal is when it shifts to the next gear, it should land around 5000 to 5500 RPM. So if it's landing and shifting much farther than that, I might move the shift point up a little bit just to keep things in that optimal rev range for the stock turbo. Now, if you have a big turbo, you probably want things to shift at redline, so this won't give you a whole lot of benefit. But I know for racing and the way that I drive, the easiest thing to do typically is to put the car in sport, floor it, and just let it shift at those optimal shift points. So setting the max RPM prevents it from going too high in the rev range. You can set it individually for drive, sport, and manual mode, and just really play with those settings to help make sure the car isn't just blowing a bunch of hot air and running at redline for no reason. Also, something to keep in mind is if you have the kickdown enabled and you hit the kickdown switch, it'll override any settings in this map and revert to the stock shift point. So that's kind of like an emergency function to set it up where it'll automatically go and just rev as high as possible. But if you're not using it or if you have it disabled, then you can definitely use those shift points to your advantage. Now, the next setting that you can change is using the stock shift maps. I have no idea why anybody would want to use this, but if you're one of those folks that just really like how the transmission shifts in stock form, this is your option to revert it to the stock shift maps, and that way you can basically flash xHP and avoid a lot of the benefits that xHP gives. The next setting is taking off in second gear. This is also something that's very common with a lot of people. I actually had it on my car and didn't know if it was working properly, but now reading through the description of this setting, it makes a lot more sense. So the whole point here is basically to delete first gear from your normal driving. So every time you leave from a stop, it'll start in second gear. Now, something to keep in mind is it does not work on cold start, which actually made me really confused because when I had it enabled, I would pull out of my driveway or reverse out of my parking spot, and when I'd pull away, it would be in first gear, or sometimes even the next stop, it would revert to first gear, which was really confusing. But now I understand that that's actually built into the setting. It always defaults to first gear when you do a cold start. It also doesn't work if you floor it from a stop, like when you're in drive mode. It's going to automatically put you in first gear. It's assuming that, again, this is some kind of emergency function where you're trying to leave as quickly as possible. So it'll give you the extra torque in first gear so that you have a little more acceleration down low. You can also set this to only work in drive mode, sport mode, or both. So I think a lot of people would prefer to use this specifically for racing. When you leave in second gear, one, it gives you less torque. So if you're having any traction issues, it puts less torque to the wheels, so you'll have better traction. And also, it reduces how many shifts you have to do when you're driving. Every shift is a small delay that can potentially slow the car down. And starting in second gear with a little less torque doesn't have like a bad trade-off compared to having an extra gear to shift through in first. So a lot of people like using this just strictly for racing, and this makes sure that you have as few shifts as possible and the most grip as possible when you launch the car. So you can do that in sport mode, and then around town in drive mode, still use first gear. I like that just simply because leaving in second gear can sometimes feel lazy, especially when you're just kind of using partial throttle and cruising. I might want a little more pep, when I'm leaving from a red light. So I use first gear in drive, but it leaves in second gear in sport. And in that case, in the future, when I try drag racing and stuff, it'll give me a little better times. Now, the next setting is the throttle blips, and you can do this in manual mode. Basically, the whole point of a throttle blip is to rev match a downshift. And this is something that sometimes people want to really feel and hear. It gives you kind of like that race car feel that some people might be looking for. So you can increase or decrease the aggressiveness. This was also one of the things that I mentioned in stage 3 I'm not a huge fan of. And so I know some people like to flash stage 3, but just dial this back so they don't have to deal with the extra, animation and noise coming from the car. So that's something that you can do to take advantage of some of those stage 3 settings without having all the extra aggressiveness when you drive in manual mode. Now, the next setting that you can change is the gear display. Again, I have no idea why somebody would want to turn this off, but the whole purpose of it is adding the little gear indicator even when you're in drive mode. So it's just kind of something that's nice to see. You know what gear you're in when you're driving around town. If you quickly hit, the paddles or something just to get a little bit of manual control for a while, and then it goes back to drive, you know exactly what's going on, what gear it's shifting in, and it just gives you more information available. But if that's too much for you to handle, then you can definitely turn it off. Now, the next setting is to adjust torque by gear. And this is another setting that can be optimized in the engine tune as well. So xHP is giving you an option to do it on the transmission side, but it's not necessarily the best feature or best way of doing things. So we all know with our torque limits, the way that it works is our engine basically communicates a certain amount of torque that it's sending to the transmission. The transmission sees that reading, and if it's above the torque limit that's set in your tune, it's going to demand that the engine pulls power. If you remove those limits, then it's going to allow the engine to run as much power as it wants. So you can actually set the limits by gear. In lower gear, some people do this to help control traction, so they'll put down a little less torque in first and second gear so that they reduce how much wheel spin they experience. But another key thing here is you can reduce how much torque you're seeing in weak gears. So a lot of people kind of question how certain cars can be so fast on stock transmission, and usually what they're doing is reducing the torque in sixth, and sometimes depending on how much power it is, they even reduce the torque in third gear, and that helps keep the transmission together. So in those gears, it won't pull as hard as it can, it'll run a little less boost, a little less torque, but for a lot of scenarios, especially like drag racing, 60 to 130 draggy times, things like that, you don't even need sixth gear. So you can reduce the torque in that gear to keep everything healthy and happy and still get all the torque in the gears that you actually use for racing. And that'll give you the performance you're looking for. So, again, this is something that you can modify in the engine tune. And if you're getting a custom tune and putting out that kind of power where it needs to be limited, that's typically the best way to do it instead of waiting for the data to go to the transmission, then get sent back to the engine and confirmed, just set it in your engine tune. That's the best way of doing things. But if you're on the fly, maybe, you're in an area where you're racing and the street's a little bit more greasy or you have a little more traction than usual, then you can adjust these sliders and help increase or decrease the torque. They also do have a couple presets as well, so feel free to play with those. It shows rear wheel drive, all wheel drive, sticky tires. So again, depending on how much grip you have, you might want different settings to help control how the car leaves off the line. But, customizing it to your own needs is probably the best way to go here. Now, the next setting is disabling the kickdown switch. And this is something that a lot of people like to do because, for example, if you're doing a draggy run, if you're doing a dyno pull, there are a lot of different settings where you want to floor your car without it downshifting on its own. If you want to start in a specific gear and stay in a specific gear for logging, this can completely disable the kickdown switch so you don't have to worry about potentially kicking that button by mistake. Now, keep in mind this also disables launch control, so if you like using launch control, you can't disable the kickdown switch and still use it. And also just keep in mind that you probably want to be a little more attentive when you're driving around town. You really don't want to floor it in super high gears like 7th and 8th gear. Try to downshift, get your car into torque, and just reduce the amount of stress that your engine is seeing. If you're lugging your engine, then you can potentially damage things. So it's just not really a good idea, for example, to try to floor it in a low RPM in 8th gear. The next setting switches off sport mode and cruise. So if you put the car in sport or sport plus or put the transmission in S, while you hit cruise control, it basically raises the revs and keeps the car in your sport mode. And I don't really use that. I don't think it's really necessary, so I do have this enabled. It reverts it to the regular drive rev range, so it'll drop your revs a little bit, and it'll also allow the car to engage 8th gear. So if you hit cruise control, typically the whole point is to let the car carry its own speed, get good efficiency, and just kind of, roll down and soak up the miles. So sport mode doesn't really give you a benefit in this scenario. I guess sometimes you might want to quickly pass somebody or whatever, so you'll give it a little bit of gas. But majority of the time, I can quickly grab the paddles or, take control and make that happen and then go back into cruise. So with this in mind, I think it makes the most sense for me to have this one enabled, but, it's kind of up to you. The next mode is auto start stop. You can disable it through xHP. Typically, it's more efficient to do this through coding or, of course, just use the button next to your steering wheel, but this just gives you another option. The next feature allows you to disable hard shifts in sport mode. So normally stage 2 and stage 3 have hard shifts in sport and sport plus. This basically disables it in sport and reverts to comfort shifting, but you're still going to have hard shifts in sport plus. Apparently there's some kind of aspect of the tuning in our cars and how Sport Plus comes together where they need to basically maintain the hard shifts to pair it with the engine tuning. So it kind of just is what it is. But again, if you like stage 2 and stage 3 and don't really like the hard shifts in sport mode, then you can disable it here. The next feature is line pressure bump, and I'll probably make another video more dedicated to talking about this specifically. But line pressure bump is to increase the clamping force on your transmission. So you can go up by 15%, and if you click this button, it basically just, maximizes how much power the transmission can hold. This is especially useful for people that have engines that don't accurately transmit how much torque is being sent to the trans. So you want to make sure that you're holding the right amount of torque and the trans isn't, acting lazy or sloppy in a scenario where it's seeing more torque than it expects. So this also can compensate for that. The next mode is valet mode. And the whole point of this is basically to neuter the car a little bit. So it limits you to 3,000 RPM. There's no brake boosting. Basically, it just softens everything so that you can't go crazy with the car. Now, the only downside is you have to flash the map in order to enable this mode. And if you're actually dropping it off with a valet, that might not be like the most opportune time to do it. But if you're giving it to a kid, letting somebody borrow your car or whatever, then you can always sync up to it, flash the map with valet mode enabled, and that'll make sure that, it prevents somebody from getting in trouble. Now, the last setting is stop and go. And I do think that this is nice, but it kind of depends on where you live. I don't have a lot of stop and go traffic where I am, so it doesn't seem like something that would give me a huge benefit. But the whole goal here is to limit how much the car is shifting between first and second gear in stop and go traffic. So if it recognizes that you're constantly bumping forward, waiting in line in traffic that's really slow, it'll start you in second gear. Now this is separate from the second gear start. So if you enable this, it will not always start in second gear. It'll only do it when you're in stop and go traffic. Again, some people with like the 8-speed automatics, they're just not fans of how often it's shifting. So doing things like this will reduce how many times you're hearing it constantly going up and down and up and down and up and down between gears when you're in heavy traffic. And yeah, those are pretty much all the settings in xHP. Again, feel free to flash your car as many times as you want. All of this is included with their license pack, so you can change all of these settings on the fly. Try anything you want, see how it works, see if you make it better or worse, and ultimately you're going to be able to give yourself the best feedback on which settings are right for you. So I just want you guys to be able to use this information to kind of determine what's wrong with your car or what you want to improve and figure out where you can make adjustments to get it better and hopefully dial it into your specific liking. Also, I'll have a link down in the description below for anybody that hasn't got xHP yet. What are you waiting for? Definitely check out that link and get a license if you're interested in tuning your transmission. Let them know I sent you. It definitely helps me out. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it for this video. So thank you guys for watching, and I hope this helps. And if you have any other questions or comments, leave them down below.